Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify, and when you want to take conversations with your fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions, and best of all, it's totally free. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today.
Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. We are going to be talking about the NFL draft, the recap of what happened and what matters in the context of the Big Ten. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review. Send me an email, bigtenfootballtalk@gmail.com. Make sure to get connected and send me feedback, send me love. We're going to get going here. I said on the pre-draft podcast that this could be a showcase for the Big Ten. It did not disappoint. It did not disappoint. Out of all the conferences, only one conference surpassed the Big Ten in overall draft picks. Only one. And no one is surprised to hear that it's the SEC, the vaunted SEC, with 62 picks. But close behind, the Big Ten had 55 picks, which is, I think, really significant. There were only 7 picks behind the SEC, and that, I think it's the most they've had in probably, I think, over 20 years. But the thing that I think was even more impressive was where those draft picks were. So over the draft, the Big Ten, I wouldn't say faded a bit, but they cooled off. But in round 1, they tied the SEC with the most picks with 9. And in round 2, they led all teams, or all conferences rather, with 11 picks. So in the first 2 rounds, the first 63 picks, the Big Ten had a third of all the picks. And I think what's also significant is that they were really spread throughout. 10 different Big Ten schools had at least one player go in the first 2 rounds. That's actually pretty insane if you think about it. So if you go through it, Penn State they didn't have anyone in the first round, although to be fair, if Miami hadn't lost a pick in the first round, the 32nd pick of the NFL draft was Joey Porter Jr. So technically, he's a second round pick, but if it were a normal draft, he would have been the last pick of the first round. Joey Porter Jr. went first overall, or first in the second round. But Penn State had three guys in round 2 go off the board. Wisconsin had a couple guys go off the board in round 2. Joe Tippmann, Keanu Benton, center and defensive tackle for those teams. Minnesota had John Michael Schmitz, who I think is a just dynamite center. He went in round 2. And Michigan had a couple of guys go in round 2, Luke Schoonmaker, DJ Turner. So a lot of good players that went off the board. Jaden Reed, I thought went a little higher than I expected, but he was in the middle of the second round. He went to the Green Bay Packers. And then you go round 1. I mean, you want to talk about the Big Ten having a night. That you had Mozzie Smith. I thought Mozzie Smith probably went a little higher than he should have as well, to the Cowboys at 27. Deonte Banks, corner out of Maryland, went 25th overall to the Giants. Jackson Smith-Njigba, the first receiver taken in the draft, went number 20, which honestly I thought was low for him, but he went number 20 overall. Jack Campbell, who I thought went way higher than expected, but he went 18th to the Lions. Lucas Van Ness, who everybody was high on, he went to the Packers at 13. Northwestern offensive tackle Peter Skoronski went 11. And then here's the crazy thing. 3 Big Ten players in the top 6 picks. Paris Johnson at 6, Devin Witherspoon at 5, CJ Stroud at 2. Trust me, you'll get to hear my thoughts about CJ going number 2. You can't not hear me go off on or be elated that Stroud went 2 after all the complaining I've done on this podcast. But that's a heck of a showing. And you want to just talk about just individual teams, right? Like Illinois had a player go in each of the top 3 rounds. If you told me that they would have 3 picks in the top 3 rounds and none of them were Chase Brown, I would have called you crazy last year. A year ago, that is. But I mean, you saw their secondary was legit, right? And we saw it earlier in the season. And now we see it in the draft. It played out. Sidney Brown going in the second round at safety. I'm loving me some Brett Bielema right now. Brett Bielema is just his development in 2 years at Illinois, because they didn't have a lot of guys. They didn't have a lot of recruits. So they're developing players. I think they're probably going to take a couple steps back with all the talent they lost. But, man, I love what Brett Bielema is doing at Illinois. I thought, the fact that every team in the Big Ten, with the exception of one, Indiana, but every team in the Big Ten had somebody drafted. I mean, it's just, I think, a great showcase for the Big Ten. So I'll talk about winners and losers here in a minute, but I think the biggest winner, or at least one of the biggest winners, is the Big Ten. Like, the Big Ten just knocked it out of the park. And, Doug Lesmerises said this on Buckeye Talk, and I agree with him. The fact that, like, the Big Ten Network and the Big Ten Conference aren't coming out and, like, bragging about this is kind of weird. Because, like, they didn't just have 55 draft picks. That alone is great. But they had 20 in the first 2 rounds. They had 25 in the first 3. I mean, that's a significant portion of your players going the first 3 rounds. I mean, you want to talk about bragging rights. Like, this is a big deal. And it's you had all these teams, and it's not just that they had a couple of draft picks. Michigan had 9. Ohio State and Penn State had 6. Maryland had 5. Purdue had 5. Northwestern, who didn't win a game in America, had 4. Michigan State, who struggled, they had 3. Minnesota had 3. Wisconsin had 3. The talent was really spread around. Now, the premier talent was at a few schools. But listen, like, Illinois had a top 5 pick. Iowa had 2 top 20 picks. You just saw that the talent throughout the conference was significant. And just for context, The SEC had 62. The Big Ten had 55. The next best conference was the ACC at 32. The Big 12 at 30, the Pac-12 at 27. So just before people are like, oh, well, I'm sure the ACC had a lot. Now, I'm sure that the Big 12 had a lot. The drop-off between the SEC and the Big 10, just absolutely significant. And comparing the elite talent in rounds 1 and 2 between the SEC and the Big 10 won. So I've said for a long time, or the past several years, the Big Ten easily is the second best conference, and I think is catching up to the SEC. I think we are seeing that, and I think we're seeing that in the games too. I think that's one of my biggest takeaways is, for the longest time, I think at the beginning of the Urban Meyer era particularly, Ohio State was really unchallenged. Like, yes, Michigan State won a couple times. But really, if you looked at Ohio State, they were easily the superior team. It is not a one-team conference anymore. And quite honestly, it's not a three-team conference either. Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. Yes, they own all the Big Ten championship games. I get that, and I'll concede that. But you're seeing Maryland start to have more talent. Purdue, Illinois, Iowa. I think Michigan State's starting to drop off a bit, but you've got teams who have guys who will make you pay. And, if I'm Ohio State, I'm particularly looking at Michigan and Penn State, but I'm looking around the rest of the conference. I'm thinking, yeah, it was a struggle to beat Maryland last year. It was a struggle to beat Northwestern. The weather had a lot to do with that, but it was a struggle to beat Northwestern. And this is not to say that Northwestern is going to beat Ohio State anytime soon, or that Northwestern could win a Big Ten championship game. That's not my point. My point is the Big Ten is starting to become a league where you can't take a weekend for granted. You can't, because there's actually enough talent to make you pay. And we've seen that, you look at Purdue. Last year Purdue was in the Big Ten championship game. I know they got smoked by Michigan. But, even 2 years ago, they had David Bell. They had George Karlaftis. Now they had a lot of guys go this year. You're starting to see the mid, bottom, and middle of the Big Ten really raise their game. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get to the Big Ten championship game. It doesn't mean any of that necessarily. What it does mean is that every week, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, it's not a walk in the park anymore. And yes, I think particularly Ohio State, although I think Penn State might have something to say about this next year, Ohio State has the talent to make you look awful, right? You've got Travion Henderson, you've got Marvin Harrison, you've got Emeka Ibuka, you've got all these fast guys who can, they can put 28 on you quick. But this is a significant development. And it's been coming. I've said it for a while. Now, let me talk about winners and losers here. And I cannot start without talking about CJ Stroud. I have been on the record saying that CJ easily is one of the top two quarterbacks. I would have picked him number one. I think Bryce Young, though, is also just incredibly good. So, no problem with Bryce going one. But with everything being said about CJ going into the draft, and for him to go number two, I just thought was really, really exciting. I really was grateful that he went. I think the Texans had themselves a draft. I just thought the Texans drafted super well, both in terms of value, but also in terms of just they got playmakers, and I thought they just drafted smart. They drafted smart for CJ. They drafted smart for their team needs. So they get CJ, and then they trade up to go and get Will Anderson. They got a center in Juice Scruggs who fits their scheme well. They got a dynamic receiver in Tank Dell. Nathaniel Dell goes by Tank from Houston. They got Henry To'oTo'o from Alabama, which I was honestly shocked that he fell all the way to the 5th round. Again, a great value. Xavier Hutchinson in the 6th, who I think is an underrated receiver out of Iowa State. I thought the Texans, man, I thought they killed it. I thought they killed the draft. I think got my favorite quarterback of the draft. They got probably the safest defensive pick and maybe the most explosive defensive pick in Will Anderson. I know the kid out of Texas Tech, a lot of people liked him. A lot of people like Lucas Van Ness. A lot of people like Jalen Carter. We'll talk about Jalen Carter in a minute. But, man, you get CJ and Will in the same draft, two of the top 4 players, two top 4 or top 5 players in this draft. Whew. Man, that's just great drafting. Speaking of winners, by the way, before I get to that, understand the Big Ten had the number 2 quarterback in the draft, the number 1 corner in the draft, the number 1 offensive tackle in the draft. They had the number 1 wide receiver in the draft. I mean, it's just crazy. Good all around. A lot of wins for the Big Ten. But anyway, talking about winners, CJ and Houston, I thought, really won the draft. I think another team that goes without question that won is the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles, we might as well just call them the Philadelphia Bulldogs at this point because they're just taking Georgia players. But what's insane, I don't know how they've done this the past 2 drafts. Their defense, they're going to win a Super Bowl, in the next 2 years. I don't know who's going to score on them. You get Jalen Carter, who they trade up 1 spot to 9 to get Jalen Carter, which was a great move because the Bears could have easily taken him there, and they're like, hey, we're going to take him. We'll give you more picks. So Jalen Carter falls to them at 9, and then Nolan Smith, who really good player, fell probably because of injury concerns. He was projected to be a top 15 pick. He goes 31. That's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. He goes 30. 30 overall. Would have been the 31st pick, but everything weird with Miami. But he goes 30th. It's another Bulldog. And then at the top of the 3rd round, they get Tyler Steen out of Alabama, who's a really good offensive tackle. They get Sidney Brown out of Illinois, who's in the 3rd round, not 2nd round. Sorry about that. And then who falls to them in the 4th round? Keely Ringo, who some mocked to the Eagles in round 1. I mean, this is... You want to talk about guys who win the draft? This is winning the draft. This is winning the draft. You get all these guys. Oh, and they got in the 7th round. They got Moro Ojamo from Texas, who was projected to be around a 4th round pick. They got him in the 7th, at the end of the 7th, almost Mr. Irrelevant. What the heck? My gosh, the Eagles killed it. The Eagles were incredible. And I recognize I am recording this in the heart of Pennsylvania, so I can't not stop at Philly because the Steelers also had a great draft. Broderick Jones, really good offensive tackle. There were 4 offensive tackles that I didn't think you could go wrong. And then they get Joey Porter, who I thought I thought arguably could have been a top 2 corner, top 3 corner. He goes at the top of the second round to the Steelers. Great story. His dad obviously played for the Steelers. Long, lengthy corner who gets his hands on everything. Keanu Benton from Wisconsin goes in at the middle of round 2. Darnell Washington, they get out of Georgia. Oh, what a pick. What a pick. Fringe first round pick. And they got him at the end of round 3. Nick Herbig, I think a good player, a solid linebacker for them. They'll probably turn him into a perennial Pro Bowler because it's the Steelers and they know what they're doing on defense. And then they get Corey Trice, who is another long corner, 6'3". He was projected to be a 3rd or 4th round pick. They get him in the 7th round. Just, again, great drafting. And then they rounded out with a pick out of Maryland and Spencer Anderson, who is a good guard. He probably is a backup in the league, but again, just great drafting. Just great drafting. A couple other winners, as much as I would have liked to see Jackson Smith-Njigba go higher, he gets to work the slot with Tyler Lockett on one side and DK Metcalf on the other. I mean, hello, 1,000 yards. I mean, that's a 1,000-yard season waiting to happen. Like nobody's going to be able to cover him. I mean, it just absurd. Just absurd, the position that he's in. So I thought he was a winner. Let me go to teams I thought, teams and people who I thought didn't win. Obviously Will Levis. I've been on the pod saying I can't fathom how Will Levis could be above CJ. That I was never frustrated about the player. I hated the hype because he got so much smoke blown up his way about him being, Mel Kiper had him the number 2 quarterback in the draft, which quite honestly, I think Mel Kiper, it's about time for him to hang it up. I just didn't understand most of his projections. I think he got 1 pick right out of his entire mock draft, which is the worst out of all mock drafters. So I did not understand it. I didn't understand all the hype behind it. But what stinks is that, you start seeing that, you're probably going to go in the first round. You're probably going to go to the top 10. And then you just sit there for hours and then you don't get picked. And so I think he landed in a good situation, right? He's with Tennessee. He's got good infrastructure there, good coaching. So I think Will Levis actually probably landed in the best spot out of all the top quarterbacks, right? Because the Titans have, they drafted a premier tackle and Peter Skronsky. Mike Vrabel has a really good team, and now it's just bringing Will Levis along. Ryan Tannehill obviously still there. Malik Willis probably is on his way out based off of reports. So I feel bad for the kid, but I would say even though he landed in the best spot for him, at least on this weekend, I thought he lost in a sense. But the consolation is he's probably in the best spot. So, I feel bad for Will Levis. Dallas, and this is somewhat me I'm not trying to take a shot at Michigan here because I think the players themselves are really good. I just thought they reached a bit. Like Mozzie Smith, you probably could have got in the second round, or you may have been able to get a better player there. I think he's good. I just don't know if he's, I think they reached a bit for him, and I thought that was true of Luke Schoonmaker too. Like, yeah, like, I guess you can justify a second round pick, especially with, Dalton Schultz moving on. I'm just not sure it was the best pick. And quite honestly, I felt like with most picks, I felt like, they're reaching for this guy. Like, they took Viliami Fehoko from San Jose State in the 4th round. And I'm like, that's feels like a reach. Deuce Vaughn, I think that's a good change of pace back in the 6th round. I thought it was a good pick. But yeah, I didn't feel like they drafted. I felt like their value, they didn't get a lot of value. They had a lot of guys, they picked a lot of guys, which quite honestly, I'm like, I think you could have waited till the end of the draft and picked them up as undrafted free agents. Now we'll see how it plays out. I thought they reached almost every pick for them was a reach. And then the last team I'll say that I thought lost was Detroit. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a really good player. I think he's going to be really good in the NFL. To trade up to get Jahmyr felt it just didn't feel. I don't know. It felt like they really climbed the ladder too high for him, especially because they could have stood pat and got him at 18, and then they probably could have got Jack Campbell in the 2nd round. Now, I will say I think the picks themselves are good, right? And they filled a lot of needs. So they got Sam Laporta, they got a running back, and they had traded away DeAndre Swift to the Eagles. So in some ways, it's a good draft in terms of filling needs. I just didn't like the value. They reached for their top 2 players. I will say, getting Brian Branch, who fell to them in the 2nd, really, really good. They do get Hendon Hooker in the 3rd round. That was really good. So I think the Lions were a bit of a mixed bag for me. I know there are some people who loved the Lions draft. I don't know how. I think Gibbs and Campbell really soured the draft for me. That being said, the fact that they got Laporta and Brian Branch in the 2nd round, I think that does cure a lot of ills as well. All in all, I thought it was a really good draft for a lot of teams. I think it was. I thought a quality draft, and I thought that. I thought for the Big Ten, it's a huge step forward. And I think there's some elite players in next year's draft too. And so I think we're going to continue to see kind of the ascension of not just Ohio State, not just Penn State one year. I think we're going to continue to see different teams do really well in the draft. I think what's striking to me is there were a lot of players in the Big Ten who I thought would get drafted that didn't. Ronnie Hickman out of Ohio State. I don't think Dante Demas got picked out of Maryland, which I was really surprised by. And then there are other players that fell that I was very surprised by. Parker Washington went in the 6th. I thought Parker Washington was easily a day 2 pick. But he didn't go till day 3. Luke Whippler and DeJuan Jones fell quite a bit. So it's a bit of a, there are a lot of players who fell, and the Big Ten still had a great draft. So I think this bodes well for the future. That'll do it for my NFL draft recap. Make sure, again, to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify. Leave a review. Again, this has been the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. Zach Guggenheim signing off. Take care. God bless.